They never whisper this part of history. They bury it in kitchens, in dinners, in calm voices that sound harmless. Listen closely, because once you hear it, you can't unhear it. Some families don't raise children, they rank them. What you're about to hear isn't a story about hurt feelings. It's about an ancient system of control that predates nations, churches, and flags. A hierarchy so old it learned to hide inside love. And if you've ever felt like you were born into last place, this will feel uncomfortably familiar. In the oldest civilizations, the firstborn was power, the second was utility, the last was expendable. That structure never died. It just learned new disguises: modern homes, polite language, warm lighting, framed family photos by the door. The Romans called it patria potestas, the father's absolute authority to decide who mattered. Medieval houses called it inheritance law. Today it wears a softer mask. She needs us more. You're stronger. You'll be fine. Those phrases aren't comfort. They're conditioning. Here's the forbidden part. Families often unconsciously create a sacrifice, not because they're evil, but because systems under pressure always choose a pressure valve. One child becomes the center of gravity, another becomes the stabilizer. The stabilizer is praised for strength, independence, resilience. But praise is the leash. Strength becomes obligation. Independence becomes abandonment with a smile. And the moment the hierarchy is spoken out loud, you come last. Something ancient snaps. Not the heart. Loyalty, because loyalty requires reciprocity. What replaces it is programming. You're taught to confuse usefulness with worth. You learn to stay quiet, to solve problems before they're announced, to read emotional weather like a survival skill. You become the unseen infrastructure holding everyone else upright. Roads aren't thanked, foundations aren't celebrated. They're only noticed when they crack. This is why the words hit so hard when they finally surface. Not because they're new, but because they confirm what your nervous system already knew. The body always knows before the mind is allowed to. And here's the dangerous truth they never prepare you for. Once you see the structure, you can't participate unconsciously anymore. You can still choose to help, but you can't pretend it's love when it's extraction. This is where the descent begins. Because walking away from a false role feels like betrayal to those who benefited from your silence. And the system will test you. What comes next is not rebellion, it's awakening. Every control system relies on one unspoken rule. The subject must believe the role is natural, that it emerged organically, that no one decided it. Because the moment you realize it was assigned, not earned, obedience collapses. This is why the most effective hierarchies don't use chains. They use narratives. In ancient priesthoods, there was always a keeper of the fire who never sat at the altar. In royal courts, there was always a steward who ran the kingdom but never wore the crown. In modern families, there is always the strong one, the reliable one, the one who doesn't need much, the one who can handle it. That role is not accidental, it's engineered through repetition. You're given just enough affection to stay bonded, but never enough priority to feel secure. You're rewarded not when you need, but when you endure. Over time, your nervous system is trained to equate self-erasure with belonging. This is psychological alchemy, turning neglect into virtue. And here's the part they don't want you to see. The system depends on your silence more than your support. The moment you stop rushing in, stop smoothing over, stop absorbing shock for everyone else, the illusion trembles. Because your presence was never passive. You were the load bearer. Institutions have always known this. Empires didn't fall when the kings were corrupt. They fell when the administrators stopped believing, when the men who carried the weight realized they were never meant to share the power. Families are no different. When you're labeled last, you're being positioned as the buffer between chaos and comfort. You are expected to absorb instability so others don't have to evolve. That's why your boundaries feel like violence to them. You're not just saying no, you're removing a structural pillar. Notice what happens when you pause instead of responding. Anxiety rises. Guilt is deployed. Urgency appears without specifics. These are not emotional reactions. They are system alarms. And you were trained to respond to alarms. But here's the forbidden realization. The system doesn't collapse when you stop playing your part. It reveals itself. The crises were always there. You were just assigned to carry them quietly so no one else had to look. This is why stepping back feels unreal at first. Like breaking a law no one ever wrote down. Your body expects punishment. Exile, collapse. Instead, there is silence. And silence is terrifying to systems built on your constant motion. This is the threshold moment, the point where men either retreat back into the familiar pain or step forward into clarity, because clarity comes with a cost. You can no longer unknow who benefits from your exhaustion, and once you see that, you're no longer last, you're dangerous. There's a reason every empire fears the man who stops asking for permission. Control systems don't break when someone rebels loudly. They break when someone quietly withdraws consent. History hides this lesson in plain sight. In ancient Egypt, the priesthood didn't collapse because peasants revolted. It collapsed when scribes, men trained to carry the invisible burden, began altering records, slowing processes, withholding energy. The temples still stood, the rituals continued, but the power drained out from underneath. Rome didn't fall when barbarians arrived at the gates. It fell when administrators stopped being. Leaving the empire deserved their sacrifice. The same principle operates inside families. When you were placed last, you were turned into infrastructure. You weren't raised to be celebrated. You were trained to be reliable. And reliability is the most exploited trait on earth, because it doesn't complain. It doesn't demand. It just works. Until it doesn't. The moment you stop trying, something unsettling happens. The mask slips. You begin to notice how often need was manufactured, how urgency replaced planning, how responsibility always flowed downhill toward the one least likely to resist. You see how your exhaustion made others comfortable, how your flexibility made their rigidity possible. This is not bitterness, this is pattern recognition. And pattern recognition is the first step out of psychological captivity. Institutions call this role deviation. Families call it you've changed. Both mean the same thing. You are no longer predictable, and unpredictability is poison to systems built on extraction. This is why guilt intensifies when you pull back. Not because you're wrong, but because the system is losing leverage. Guilt is not a moral signal. It's a control mechanism triggered when boundaries appear. Think about it. If you were truly last because you mattered less, your absence wouldn't cause panic. But it does. Because you were never last in function, only in recognition. You were essential without authority, powerful without credit, necessary without protection. That arrangement only works as long as you believe your value comes from being needed. Here's the dangerous truth most men never hear. Being needed is not the same as being respected, and respect never grows where access is unlimited. When you stop over-functioning, others are forced to confront their own underdevelopment. Some will rise. Others will resent you for removing the cushion that kept them comfortable. This is where false loyalty reveals itself, because loyalty that only flows one way is not loyalty. It's dependency disguised as love. This is the moment the descent deepens. You're no longer just seeing the structure, you're feeling its resistance. And resistance is proof you're moving in the right direction. From here on, there is no return to innocence, only awareness. This is the point in every forbidden history where the initiate is tested, not by enemies, but by the familiar. Because systems don't defend themselves with force at first, they defend themselves with emotion. When you stop trying, when you stop reaching, when you stop absorbing the weight that was never meant to be yours, the system interprets it as a threat, not consciously, instinctively. Like an organism sensing the loss of blood pressure, this is where the manipulation sharpens. Concern replaces control. Are you okay? Sounds caring, but listen closely. It's surveillance. Confusion replaces accountability. You seem different lately. Translation, you're no longer behaving in a that benefits us. Nostalgia is weaponized. Old memories are resurfaced, selectively edited to remind you who you used to be. Useful, quiet, dependable. This is not accidental. It's psychological counterinsurgency. Ancient mystery schools warned about this phase. They called it the turning of the voices. When those who once praised your strength begin to frame your boundaries as cruelty. When independence is recast as selfishness. When silence is treated like betrayal. And here's the hardest truth to swallow. Some people only love the version of you that bleeds, quietly. This is why stopping feels heavier than trying ever did. When you were overgiving, the pain had direction. Now the pain is internal. You're confronting the realization that your role was never mutual, it was functional. This is where men either fold or forge themselves, so let me mark this moment. Not for the algorithm, though it matters, but for identity. Because rituals lock transformation into the nervous system. If this is landing, if you recognize yourself in this descent, comment the phrase, "I withdraw my consent." Twice, not once, twice. Let it be seen. T destabilizes the narrative that justified your placement at the bottom. Remember this, systems never admit they were wrong. They accuse you of changing, and you did change. But not into something worse, into something awake. Here's the part they don't prepare you for. When you stop being the last priority, you don't immediately become the first. You become separate. And separation is terrifying to people who relied on your constant proximity to avoid confronting themselves. You'll notice conversations thinning out, invitations becoming conditional, affection turning transactional. This is not rejection, it's recalibration. The system is testing whether you'll panic and rush back to restore the old balance. This is where psychological control has always done its finest work, not with force but with loneliness. Secret societies knew this, religious orders knew this, totalitarian states knew this. Isolation weakens resolve, unless the man understands what's happening. Unless he knows that solitude at this stage is not punishment. It's initiation, because here's the suppressed truth. The moment you stop trying to be chosen, you become uncontrollable. You're no longer negotiating for scraps of attention. You're no longer managing other people's emotions to earn peace. You start directing that energy inward, toward your body, your finances, your discipline, your future. And this is when something strange happens. Your clarity threatens people who built their identity around your availability. Your calm feels like judgment to those who depended on your chaos. Your boundaries feel like abandonment to those who never planned to stand on their own. But none of that is your responsibility. You were never meant to be the emotional infrastructure of someone else's life. That role was assigned because you were capable, not because it was fair. This is the phase where the lie finally collapses. You were not last because you were lesser. You were last because you were reliable. And once reliability is reclaimed and redirected toward yourself, the entire hierarchy loses its grip. What replaces it is not revenge. It's sovereignty. And sovereignty is what the next section exposes, because it's the one thing no control system can survive. Sovereignty doesn't arrive like confidence. It arrives like stillness. A quiet recalibration where your nervous system stops scanning for approval and starts orienting toward purpose. This is the phase ancient texts warned about, but rarely described in detail, because it produces men who cannot be ruled the same way twice. When you withdraw from a system that defined you as last, you don't just change behavior, you change posture. Your voice slows. Your decisions take fewer words. You stop explaining. An explanation was the last thread tying you to the old order. Here's what becomes visible now, how deeply you were trained to over-justify your existence. Every "I can't" once came with a paragraph. Every boundary dead context. Every choice required permission disguised as courtesy. That was not politeness. That was conditioning. Institutions perfected this by rewarding men who complied without friction. Families perfected it by praising those who never asked for more. But sovereignty exposes the flaw in that design. A man who no longer needs to be understood cannot be controlled through misunderstanding. This is where the system's final tactic appears, moral inversion. You'll be told that stepping back is selfish, that prioritizing yourself is abandonment, that strength means sacrifice without limit. These are not values, they are levers. They only apply in one direction. Notice how rarely the question is asked in reverse. Who carried you? Who adjusted for you? Who was expected to endure so you wouldn't have to? Silence answers that question. This is why sovereignty feels lonely at first. Not because you're wrong, but because you've stepped outside the script. You're no longer playing the role that made everyone else comfortable. And comfort, not love, was the real currency all along. Across suppressed histories, this is the moment when men disappeared from records. Not because they died, but because they could no longer be categorized. They weren't rebels, they weren't loyalists, they were independent operators. Families experience this as distance. Systems experience it as loss of control. You experience it as relief, followed by grief. Grief for the version of you that tried harder, waited longer, hoped quietly. That grief is not weakness, it's the final shedding of identity that kept you small enough to manage. And here is the most dangerous truth in this entire descent. Once you've lived without trying to earn your place, you cannot return to begging for it. The body rejects the old posture. The soul refuses the old bargain. You are no longer last. You are no longer ranked. You are no longer available for unconscious sacrifice. What remains is choice. And choice is the one thing no hierarchy can tolerate because it reveals that obedience was never natural. It was learned. And what is learned can be unlearned, which brings us to the final revelation, one that decides whether this knowledge fades or changes you permanently. Here is the final truth they never say out loud, because once you hear it, the spell breaks completely. You were not placed last by accident. You were placed there because someone had to be strong enough to survive it. Every hidden system, family, institution, empire, sacrifices its most capable members first. Not the weakest, the strongest, the adaptable, the ones who don't collapse under pressure. Power doesn't fear fragility, it exploits competence. That's why you were trusted with less support and more responsibility. That's why your pain was minimized while others were protected. That's why you were told you'd be fine. Because you were, and because you were, they never had to change. This is the secret. Be you. Ride inside countless dark histories. The ones who hold the system together are never meant to inherit it. They are meant to maintain it until they're empty, until they wake up. Once you stop trying, once you withdraw your consent, the hierarchy doesn't just lose a participant, it loses its justification. Because your compliance was the proof it needed to call itself fair. Without you, the lie is exposed. This is why some people will never forgive you for choosing yourself. Not because you harmed them, but because you forced them to see what they relied on without earning. Understand this clearly. You do not owe access to those who only valued your availability. You do not owe loyalty to structures that required your silence. And you do not owe explanations to anyone threatened by your clarity. The descent ends here, but the work does not. From this point forward, every decision becomes intentional. Who gets your time? Who hears your plans? Who benefits from your strength? You stop giving your power away unconsciously and start deploying it deliberately. That's what mastery actually is, not domination, not revenge, not cold detachment, discernment. You learn where to invest and where to withdraw. You learn that being last taught you something first place never could. How to stand alone without collapsing, how to survive without applause, how to build without permission. And once a man knows he can do that, he is no longer controllable by guilt, fear, or withheld approval. He becomes sovereign. This is dangerous knowledge because it spreads quietly. One man stops trying, another notices, another follows, and suddenly systems that depended on silent endurance begin to crack. If this reached you, it wasn't random. Some truths only surface when a man is ready to stop begging for his place and start choosing it. You were never meant to come last forever. You were meant to wake up,